Hi everyone, my name is Will Abson. I want to talk to you a little bit about Share Extras. This is a project that Jeff mentioned earlier. I'll talk a little bit about the project. I've got a few slides to show. If you want to access the slides online and follow along, you can try that QR code and see if that works. I think these things are great. Might be a little bit easier for you to follow along there. So that should take you straight to the Summit website. So I introduced myself. I've been at Alfresco for a few years now. I started working with Alfresco Share back in 2008 when we first launched Share in Alfresco 3.0. The Share Extras project itself came out of a few dashlets that myself and a couple of contributors had put out there. We got these together. We started a project around that. And that's been going fairly strong ever since. We've now got about 40 add-ons there in the project. I myself moved over into R&D to do a bit around this area. I joined the integrations team last year, so about 12 months ago. So I've been working on Google Docs integrations, Salesforce integrations with Jared, who was the last presenter up here. So I'm still doing plenty of this. The project was started in 2010, as I mentioned. We've got a large number of add-ons. I haven't been through recently and counted the number of downloads that we've got, but it's definitely in the tens of thousands there of downloads that we've had in total. Originally, the project was hosted on Google Code, and that URL is still there. It now has a link, so telling you to go off somewhere else. And that somewhere else is GitHub. So that's really the subject of this talk. I want to talk about where the project is right now, what we've been doing over the last year, which is mostly moving from Google Code to GitHub. So I think hopefully for some of you who are managing your own projects, there's some lessons in there and some feedback from what we've been through that might be useful to you. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So these are some of the projects that we have in Share Extras. So it's really, really varied, the projects that we have. So we've got things like maps to weather forecasts, Twitter integrations there. I was just in my last talk talking about OAuth-based integrations that we've done with Twitter, with LinkedIn, with Yammer, with Salesforce, and even GitHub itself. They have a cool API. So there's a real diversity of projects out there. As I mentioned, there's around 40 or so of these now out there on the project site. We don't just provide the add-ons itself. I think one of the early goals for Share Extras was not just to implement all the possible add-ons we could think of, because there was quite a lot we could think of at the time, but to accept the reality that the community is a lot larger than this one project. So what can we do in addition to providing a few useful add-ons? Well, we can also encourage best practice, and we can provide some code snippets, some sample projects that hopefully people can use to get started on their own project there. I think this is certainly changing our role within the Alfresco community there. There's a lot more services out there. I mentioned that we started off on Google Code. There's now a lot more services out there that allow you to go out there and start off your own open source project. And not just host the code, but host the downloads, the documentation. Things like continuous integration services, like Jenkins, Atlassian have hosted offerings around this. There's really a much bigger variety of tools out there. So I think in terms of hosting add-ons, that's really not the main value of Share Extras now to me. The value is promoting best practice, getting other people's contributions on board, and acting as perhaps gatekeepers, if you like, to the projects that are there already. So processes and contributions are the two areas where I want to focus on going forward over the next 12 months. And really the work we've done in the last year or so allows us to do that. Now this is a picture in reference to John's point earlier, this is the British variant. There's an American variant of this picture out there. They both date back to similar times, so the start of the 20th century, when we needed lots of people to sign up for a large task that we had on our hands back then. I showed this picture at a meetup event back in 2010, and really it was to make the point that it's really the job of the community, much like Jeff's talk earlier, to help itself and to help other people. So there's a lot that you can do with the Alfresco community. I think this picture just conveys that quite well in one image. What that does mean is not that you just set up your own projects, but actually that you actively can add to the projects that are already there. So this is really the context that I'm really interested in. How do you make it easier for people to contribute to those projects that are already there? It might be one line of code, but that changes an integration or an add-on in some really rich way. It might be adding a language pack, support for another language to an integration. People have done that with Share Extras. So we really want people to be able to come into these projects and to join in these existing efforts. So that was really the aim behind the changes that we've made over the last year or so, to make this actually a reality, to allow people to join in. So I mentioned we've migrated from Google Code to GitHub. I started having conversations around this with some of the other collaborators on the Share Extras projects in Berlin last year at last year's DevCon event. It's taken a long while to do this, a lot longer than I thought. There's actually a lot of things involved in an open source project in terms of concrete things that actually exist out there that are files or resources out there on the internet. Moving from one provider to another is really not an easy thing. It's not just the source code. You've got all these other issues, all these other things around the projects, like issues, like wiki pages, like downloads, binary artifacts that you need to think about. Even leaving those aside, you're talking about migrating from one SCM implementation to another. In this case, we moved from Subversion to Git, and I'll talk about some of the benefits of that in a minute. But that was a big thing in itself, just moving the code over, because we needed to map from one system to another. Now, there's tools around there that will help you do that. git-svn is great. There are various wrappers around that enable you to map complete projects with one command. So that was really helpful. The goal in doing this migration was to preserve the code and the change history of all of the projects as they were on Google Code. So we wanted that history there, because that's really important as an open source community, that you see the change history, you see who's contributed to the project, and you see that going back, in Share Extras case, 3 or 4 years. So we really wanted to preserve that. And also on the different branches that we had, moving those over. So this all took a bit of time. I mentioned about the changelog. Well, the identities of those people that are involved in the project needed to be transferred over. How do you map from a Google Code profile to a GitHub profile? Well, actually, git-svn has a way of doing that by mapping from one email address to another. And that means that when you go to a Share Extras project on GitHub now, and you look at the change history there in the web view, you can click on the name of the person who made a specific change, say 2 years ago, and that will map over to their GitHub profile. You can see all their other contributions as well. So that was a really important point to get right, to make sure that people are acknowledged that the metadata was transferred over correctly. Structurally, we made a lot of changes as well. Previously, Share Extras was one big project. Now, that seemed like a great idea when we started in 2010. It really simplified things for us because we just needed one project. It was fine when we had a few dashlets. It got a bit more complex when we had 40. We needed to start breaking those apart. So GitHub actually allows us to do that very easily because it has these notion of organizations. Google Code didn't really have that, and this was actually one of the main drivers, I think, for us to move. We've now registered a Share Extras organization on GitHub, so if you go to github.com/share-extras, then that gives you the list of all the projects that we own within GitHub there. So it ties those up nicely together, whereas Google Code couldn't really do that. It was all atomic, it was all single projects, and you couldn't link them together in any meaningful way and tie them up into a cohesive whole. So we have broken apart Share Extras into lots of different projects. And I think this is going to really help us in terms of getting people to check out the code and collaborate around it and to give those contributions back to us when they have made changes that are useful for others. So this was also a big exercise when we migrated stuff over. So this illustrates what we had before. We had the main project root there. So this was our layout in Subversion. We had trunk, which was where the current work is going on. And then underneath trunk, we had these different add-ons there. So underneath those, you'd see a source directory, you'd see a web directory, etc. Configuration. We had branches as well, so we had a 1.0 branch, which preserves the 3.4 compatibility. So when Alfresco 4 came out, we created this 1.0 branch to say that, okay, we're going to make some changes now that aren't going to be backwards compatible with 3.x versions of Alfresco. And those changes have been really good for us, but the branches needed to preserve that compatibility. So it has some branches. We didn't actually have any tags. Because it's really hard to tag the whole thing in a meaningful way. What we actually ended up doing is working within these individual projects, and we didn't have branches and tags within there. So the tags didn't really tend to get used, and we had a lot of complexity at this top level here. This is now what we've moved to in GitHub. So this is a much simpler layout. Have the Share Extras organization at the top that I mentioned. Then underneath that, we have these 40 or so sub-projects, effectively. Within each project, we also have a series of branches. I mentioned the 1.0 branch. We have this master branch, which is equivalent to trunk in Subversion. And we actually use a lot more branches now in GitHub because we can create these at will, and it's actually a very lightweight process in Git, much more so than in Subversion. We actually use these branches now for units of work. So in the talk I was just talking about, these are 2 branches that were created to do that work on the OAuth capabilities that are provided by Share OAuth there. So that was some of the work we were doing in the run-up to DevCon there. Okay. So now that we have this great new structure, and we have much smaller projects, it's much easier for people to grab the code, as I said, and to contribute that. Now, I think one of the things that we've come to realize as developers in the last few years is that forking can actually be a really good thing. The bad thing about forking is when people go off and do their own thing and don't talk to the project owners, the original project owners, and things get out of sync, and it's really because people have different ideas about where a project should be going. What GitHub has done, and a lot of these other Git-based online services, is they've made people realize that forking can actually be really good for a project. People can create a copy of that in their own world. They can go off and they can start playing with things, because that's what developers want to do, right? They just want to write some code and see if it works. Then, when it does work, then they can go back to the owners and say, hey, I've done this thing, it's quite cool, you might want to check it out, have a look at it. In fact, please actually take this code and do that. GitHub does that through pull requests. So if I fork a project, I can then send a pull request back to the original owner myself, and I can say, this is quite cool, please take it on board. And it gives you a structured way to do that. So I don't have to go in the command line or in Eclipse, generate a patch file, email that off to the developer. It's all handled through their web-based workflows. And you don't have to be using GitHub. You can use other providers as well, but GitHub is what we used, and I've used it in the examples here throughout, because it's the most popular service that's out there. Just to illustrate that, how we are really using this, in the first 3 weeks of migrating the code over to GitHub, we had 3 separate pull requests. We had 1 a week from people who wanted to make changes. They weren't big changes, you know, they were adding buttons here, there, and there, they were fixing bugs, and they were adding different language support. But that stuff is really critical because it actually really makes someone's life a lot better. So those are just small things. And the project really benefits from having those come back to us through these pull requests. Now, we did have to get used to a few of the differences between Git and Subversion. First major difference is some of the terminology around master instead of trunk, etc. Branching is quite different in Git. It's, as I mentioned, more lightweight. And so the emphasis is on creating lots of branches for a unit of work. You might call those topic branches. We use them a lot inside of Alfresco, even with Subversion. It makes that process a lot easier in Git. So the idea is that if you're starting a bit of work, you always create a branch. And you do that quite a lot. So branching is different. And when you pull down a repository to your local machine, you're not just pulling down one branch either. You're pulling down the whole repository. So you're not checking out a project, you're cloning it on your local machine. And that makes you actually a lot more powerful as a developer because you have the whole change history across all the branches of all the projects on your local machine there. So if you're on a plane and you decide you want to make some changes, you don't have to wait until you land and get in the taxi and get to your hotel room to check those changes in. And that's even if the Wi-Fi connection is working. You check it in on the plane while it's still fresh in your mind. So this is a game changer. I think one of the benefits that I've had as well is I actually now use a lot less disk space on the machine because I can pull in these multiple branches, and for every branch I'm working on, I don't need a separate checked out working copy. The Alfresco source code, to give you an example of this, is a few gigs. So if you're working on 10 branches, well, that's a lot of disk space already. I use Git now to manage that, and it actually only uses about, I think, about 4 gigs, and I've got 10 branches checked out. So it's much more efficient in terms of how it checks out these different branches and how it stores those internally. They're all stored in one place. So we've really benefited from that. Another change that we've made that has actually come from our migration to GitHub is increased use of Maven within the project. So we didn't plan to do this. Axel Faust, who's one of our partners in Germany, actually looked at the JavaScript console and made some changes in his own fork to use Maven to do the build of that. I think based on that, myself and Florian, who's the owner of the JavaScript console, looked at that and said, hey, we can use this a lot more, certainly with a new project and also for some existing projects. So we're really increasing the use of Maven now, and that came from someone forking the project saying, I really think you can do this better. If you know Gab Columbra, he's been banging on about this to me for years. And I understood why it was good, but it takes someone to come and actually do that work and apply it to the project before you really see the benefits as a project owner. So we're slowly Mavenizing the different projects in Share Extras, and that's really come from a pull request. Documentation, that's a huge area in projects and one that's often overlooked. I was trying to find a screenshot of the Share Extras project site last night, and I couldn't find one anywhere. So I went to the Wayback Machine, archive.org, and I dug out a copy from, if I can read that, I think August this year. of the main project site. For some reason, the CSS didn't come through from the Google Code homepage there that you see. But actually, it didn't really look much different to that. I think the font was Arial rather than Times, but apart from that, it was pretty much the same. That doesn't really jump out to you as the home page for a project with 40 add-ons and tens of thousands of downloads, but that's what was easy to do with Google Code at the time. So we had that website. It was wiki-based, used wiki markup. We also had a wiki page for each add-on that was on the site there. And we had READMEs within the source code of each project. There was quite a bit of duplication going on there. So we had installation instructions and instructions on how to build the code in the READMEs. But that was also on the wiki pages as well. So every time we updated the version of the software, you need to update the version label in the file names that are referenced in the docs. We had to do that in 2 places. It didn't always get done. So stuff was getting out of sync. And that was a big concern as a project owner. Now what we do is we use the READMEs as the primary documentation in the project. We have a README file in each project. GitHub actually notices that and has a HTML view that it automatically applies to your project that gives you a HTML rendition of that README file. We also have a new project website, and that project website is also driven through this markdown file format that's used by the READMEs. So that project website content is actually a separate GitHub repo underneath Share Extras, so it's not implementing an add-on, but it's implementing our website. And all this content is driven from that same set of READMEs. So that's really cool. We've got rid of all that duplication, and we just got one place to update our strings when we make a new release. That's what the project page looks like now in GitHub. So that's an example for one of the add-ons, for the media viewers add-on that provides the PDF.js and a few other content viewers for the web preview component in Alfresco. You see the list of files at the bottom. What you see down there, right at the bottom, it's a bit cut off, but that's the README file. So that README file is one of the files in the list there. GitHub realizes that and gives you a HTML rendition. So we've got screenshots in there, we've got instructions on building. It means when someone checks out the code, they can go into that in a text editor if they don't have internet access, and they can see how to build this stuff. But they can also see it on the website there. So it's one source. The markdown that we use, it's pretty much standard markdown. GitHub have this concept of they call it GitHub flavored markdown, and they've got a few extensions to that. But most of the stuff we're using is pretty much core markdown. And markdown is really cool. It's designed as a naturally readable markup language. So if you try and read a HTML document, it actually takes quite a long time. If you're looking at the raw tags, you look at H2, it doesn't mean anything straight away to your brain. Well, markdown changes that. So headers are marked up with dashes and equals signs to underline them as plain text. You see examples of doing bold, italics, and it just makes sense to the eye when you read this stuff. So if you go with a text editor, if you're on a command line and you want to have a look at the README, you can read it. But it also means that using this markdown syntax, GitHub can generate HTML renditions of it really easily without using up much resource. The project website, as I mentioned, it's stored in GitHub there as its own separate repo. We use HTML for some static content that we've got there. We've got an About Us page. We've got some basic information on how to contribute to the project. So that's all in there as HTML sitting in the GitHub repo, and we can update that directly. The information about each add-on, as I mentioned, comes from the READMEs. So we generate a project page for each of the add-ons within the website. based on the README content. As well as the README content, I actually have a script that pulls in from the GitHub API information about each project. One of those metadata values that the GitHub API exposes is it has an update time. So it tells you the last time that a check-in was made or an issue was updated or something like that. So that's a timestamp that it gives you from that API. The script that I have, it's just a Python script. It's pretty simple, and it's also in that. It's also in the website GitHub repo. That was the URL was on the previous slide, so you can have a look at that Python source code. It actually plugs in that metadata, like the update time, into the project pages. That's important because the order in which you list projects on the home page is actually quite important. And what we want to do, the goal was to, very much like GitHub does if you go into their own pages, on the project website, I want to list at the top the projects that have been recently updated, because those are the ones where there's stuff happening. People probably want to get involved, download it, and have a look. And it also gives developers an incentive to do things, because when they make changes in their projects, an hour later, when the website gets regenerated, that project has bubbled up to the top of the Share Extras website. So that's what the site looks like. It uses Twitter's Bootstrap library for basic rendering, CSS. And there's actually not a lot behind that. We use Markdown in there. We use Jekyll, which is the markup syntax that allows you to loop over things within pages and spit out that list of projects, say, based on the series of READMEs that we have for each project there. So we're using Jekyll, we're using Markdown, we're using some pretty cool tools there. And I think it looks a lot better than the Google Code projects, right? When you click into an add-on, that's what it looks like. So you've got this content in the main body. That, as I mentioned, comes from the README. So GitHub makes a HTML rendition of the README, and we also make a HTML rendition of the README on the project site there when we regenerate it. So that gets plugged in there. On the left-hand side, we have a sidebar. It gives you a quick bit of information about the project, title, description. You've got links to download or to view the project's page. In a lot of the projects, what we're building in now is a third button, and the third button takes you off to the project site on Alfresco add-ons. Previously, that wasn't really linked into Google Code at all. So if you like an add-on or you want to add a comment to it, we don't support that on the website, but what you can do is you can go over to Alfresco add-ons and you can do that there. So it just brings everything together. It brings in this website, it brings in the downloads, it brings in the GitHub project site on Alfresco add-ons. And that's for each and every add-on we're going through and doing that. The other thing that we have here on the top right is we have a fork me banner. So if you click that, it takes you off to GitHub. You can click the fork button, and that then walks you through checking out your projects locally and talking you through how to make changes and then submit a pull request. So we want to make it as easy as possible from this page for people to go in and do that. One of the things that we've also changed, I mentioned the Maven stuff that we're bringing in for building. Related to that, we're also trying to be a lot more consistent, firstly between individual add-ons, but secondly between us and the rest of the Alfresco community in terms of being consistent, how we package stuff up and how we give it to people. So we have used jars in the past. Some projects have started using amps. What we're trying to do now is to bring that together and say all projects, every new release is going to generate an amp and it's going to generate a jar. Some people like one, some people like the other. I'm also trying to get some consistency there so that the amp file actually just contains the jar file. So all the AMP is just a wrapper for that jar file. I think one of the things that's not so great about AMPs is the fact that when you install them, it may install a couple of hundred files into your Alfresco web app. If you've lost your backups, your backed up web app that it gives you as part of that installation, if that goes away, if that disappears, if that gets cleaned up by someone, because they're pretty big, these things, it's actually really hard to uninstall AMP files. But we actually get around that. If all the AMP does is install a jar and a module.properties file, if the worst comes to the worst, the sysadmin can always go in and uninstall that. So we're trying to bring that into all the projects now. I've started with the media viewers project that you saw the screenshot of in the previous page. I mentioned that as well as focusing on contributions, we want to focus a lot more on the process of developing add-ons. This is, I think, something we've been a bit lax with in the past. I want to be more strict that for every release now in Share Extras, this is what we do. We do a build. Currently, that's a local build. But as I said, we're bringing in Maven for this to get more consistency between these local builds. So you build the new release. You do that locally right now. You tag that in the Git repo. So that'll be v something. That'll be the tag. You push that tag up to GitHub. One of the really nice capabilities of GitHub around tags is that it recognizes when you've added a new tag to a project. And a tag is actually something special in Git. It's not like Subversion, where it's really just a branch. And you can go and change that if you want. A tag is special in GitHub. It's a special concept. So GitHub recognizes this as a new version. You go to the releases section. It has a placeholder there for that. So as the project owner, you can then say, yep, this is version 0.2. This is what I just created. And I'm going to add a name to that. I'm going to add some release notes to that. And I'm going to drag and drop, in using the web browser, the files that I've just created through that local build. So there'll be a jar file and an AMP file. You add those to the release. You click Save. There's one last step, which with Gabriele Columbro's help, I've now added in, which is pushing these artifacts to artifacts.alfresco.com. So we have a Share Extras repository on there. So not only are we pushing the releases up to GitHub, we're pushing them out to Maven as well. And that means that if someone has a specific project, an Alfresco implementation in their organization, and they want to add in 5 Share Extras add-ons, all they need to do is they need to declare a war project based on the Alfresco Maven SDK, and just provide these as dependencies. Maven will pull them in. It'll add them in. Obviously, it'll be pulling in the AMP files. It'll apply those to their wars. And out of that, they'll get a war file that has their core Alfresco, the version that they want, that's supported. And they'll have these add-ons installed as well. So that's something that, again, we're trying to be a lot more rigorous about this. This is another slide that I dragged out of history here. This was one I actually showed at the Alfresco DevCon event that we did in London in 2010. That was actually the first DevCon or Summit event, as we call it now, that I went to. And I showed this slide specifically in reference to changing the Alfresco UI and some of the customization capabilities that we had in. And I think I said in terms of the Alfresco add-ons that we're about here. Well, maybe that wasn't quite true. Maybe we're about sort of here still. But we've now come a long way, and we're sort of standing up now. But I think we've moved on from Share Extras being a project about showing off some cool whizzy functionality that you can extend Share. More to being a bit more grown up, trying to be a bit more robust about these processes. And we made this whole switch to GitHub last year so that we could we could provide better tools to developers, encourage more contributions, and get people involved in the project. As Jeff said, we're all bees. There's only 4 of us developing share extras. We're actually not really growing that team in terms of the core people who look after the projects, but what we do want to do is get lots more bees working and get them to push their contributions back to the project. So I could also view this diagram in terms of where we are in the life cycle of the overall project and how grown up we are about that and what we're doing. So, I'd say we're about in the middle there. We've still got some work to do. I do want to get some of these things done this year. Some of the stuff that's coming up in the Maven SDK is really, really cool. I was chatting with someone on day 0 of the project when we had the hackathon. And they said, oh, when are you going to move all the Share Extras add-ons over to Maven fully? And I said, well, we're doing that for the new projects. We're doing that for the ones that have Java code, where it is really justified because it's hard to set up a Java project on your own if you don't have Maven there. So we are making more use of that, but I can't see it being used for all the projects because it's just too much work to move over all the projects, and there's not really a huge amount of benefit. If you've just got a simple project, just involves some JavaScript and some config, well, I've actually rethought that over the last 2 days, and the reason for that is some of the changes that are coming down, particularly in terms of the ability to rapidly deploy your application to a running Alfresco instance. Seeing some of the stuff that Gab was demoing yesterday really blew my mind. So I think we certainly need to move over more to Maven to take advantage of some of those testing capabilities. In parallel with that, what's coming in is, I hope, this isn't a roadmap session, but a few of the UI developers are looking at some proper unit testing frameworks, integration testing frameworks for Share, so for the front end. So we don't really have any tests at the moment in the Share Extras project for the front end code because there isn't really a framework there that we can plug into. But that is coming, so we really want to investigate those frameworks there. The last thing is getting away from this concept of having local builds. So there's a lot of services now out there in the same way that you have GitHub to manage your source code. There's a lot of web-based, cloud-based services out there that can plug into that. If you've got a project on GitHub, one of the areas that they have is a settings page. In that settings page, there's an area called webhooks, I think. They have a long list of about 50 providers of services that are useful for developers. And what GitHub allow you to do is on every single commit, they push details of that commit out to those services. So there's continuous integration services, particularly that I want to take advantage of, so that we're getting the builds done and pushed out to Maven and pushed out to GitHub properly. So we're no longer reliant on local builds. So we've got the process sorted. Now let's streamline it and make it a lot easier. The last thing that I didn't mention with Maven is we want to declare we want to start with the Share Extras parents POM. That gives us one place. When we make changes, we've had to make some changes because of the way we use Maven ourselves. Of course, we're building on top of the Alfresco SDK parent POM, but we want to make our own changes sometimes. And some of those changes, it might be useful to push upstream, back up to Alfresco. So if we've got our own parent POM, that gives us one place that we can put those new features as they become stable and then push them further up the chain. So more use of Maven, more use of some of these richer services now that we've got a GitHub capability, and we can take advantage of some of the richer capabilities that GitHub allows us to push out to, and better testing. So that's the project site. You saw the screenshot of that earlier. So that's a GitHub repo, and it's running out of that. And that will take you to the main project website where you can have a look, download some of the add-ons, and please get involved. So we should have time for some questions. Do you have any? Okay, couple.
Yeah. What are the steps to contribute a new project to the share extras? So in case I have my own repository in the GitHub side,
yeah,
and I want my let's say control to be merged into primary repository, what should I do in this situation?
Okay. So the first thing I would probably throw back is another question at you, which is, do you really need to contribute this to the Share Extras project? I think we've got a lot of projects. I guess we're aware of the burden that there is on maintenance that and maintaining that, and we do want to spread that burden out. As I said, one of the main changes that's coming is, we really don't see ourselves as a big repository where we need to contain all the add-ons that are out there in our Alfresco community. But we are putting in these processes as like release processes. Think of us like Apache in a way. We're more of an effort around these add-ons. So, yeah, I think if you're interested in getting more of the best practice that we have, you can get some of that just by copying our files and copying our methodologies. But if you want to be a part of that and a real part of the project, then we can talk about that. There is a page, if you go to that URL, it's called, there's a navigation bar. We have a navigation bar on the main website, which we couldn't do with Google Code before. And one of the links in that main navigation call is contribute. So that really does what it says on the can, and it's got a list of criteria and some guidance around contributing your own projects. But you shouldn't feel that you have to contribute your project to Share Extras. The community is a lot bigger than that. And not what's important isn't where they live, but it's who's working on them, how often they get updated, released, and how robust your processes are as a project. So.
Okay, thank you.
So thanks for the presentation, Will. The engineering teams use Subversion and do the core Alfresco for a long time. You've moved Share Extras to Git. I know some of the engineering projects have kind of moved. Is there a roadmap, a plan for larger use of Git over Subversion, or is it still pretty ad hoc?
So, you look at, going back to the start of the presentation, I talked about moving the source code over. That was a big job for two reasons. Firstly, because we needed to move from Subversion to Git. That was a big enough job in itself. But also because the project itself was too big. It was one project, so we needed to break it apart. Git isn't really friendly to big monolithic projects. It works a lot better if your projects are smaller, and that's best practice these days anyway. So I'd say from a personal perspective, if you migrated over the whole Alfresco code base as it currently is, as structured, into Git, that probably wouldn't solve all the problems around that. Some of the smaller projects, certainly internally we've started using Git there. We've discussed moving over some of the integrations over to Git. So the chatter dashlet that I showed that connects to Salesforce, that's actually not part of Share Extras, but we have an Alfresco organization on GitHub there, and we developed that as part of some proof of concept work we did about 6 months ago that I worked on, and that's been pushed out to the Alfresco org on GitHub. So we're starting to push those out. In terms of individual developers, if you like Git and you want to use that, the fact also that something is stored in Subversion, and that's the primary upstream repo, it doesn't mean you can't work in Git. I work in Git every day now using the main Alfresco source tree, and I use git-svn to manage that. So I've got all these branches checked out into that Git repo, and I can have 10 of these, and it saves me all that disk space. And more importantly, I don't type git checkout and stupid things like that, because I'm trying to work with Git and SVN, both of them on a daily basis. So yeah, I've moved fully over fully over to it, and other people can do as well. It doesn't necessarily require that we immediately move the entire Alfresco source tree over to Git. You can still use it. Okay.
Hi, this is G. So I was wondering if you guys have any plans on having or moving your main source repository to, say, a read-only Git repo, so we could just clone it from GitHub or whatnot?
Well, in terms of moving it, I'd say it's the same answer as the last question, really. Cloning it, there was actually, I can't recall the name of one of the partners was maintaining a read-only clone of the Subversion tree. I can't recall who that was, but we can find that out for you.
Okay. Well, I actually maintain one, but it's sort of messy. And I was just wondering if you guys had any plans like Apache does.
Okay. Probably not my call, I'd say, but we'd definitely be interested in talking some more about that. So maybe we could talk after.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thanks. I was going to mention, if you ever try git-svn, be aware that the way directories are handled are very different between the two systems. You've got to be cautious.
Yeah, directories aren't tracked by Git, are they?
Yeah.
If they're empty.
Oh, go ahead.
If they're empty, they're not tracked, yeah.
Yeah. But I was going to ask, so a lot of the Share Extras is a really good example of how an open source project manages a variety of contributors. Any tips on how the communication works between you and the 3 other members of the core team and all the random people that come in and out? What tools have been effective there?
So we have a mailing list. The mailing list isn't really used a huge amount, and we should use it a lot more. So I'd say that's definitely useful to have. That's the one thing that we're still using on the Google side, actually, is the mailing list is a Google group, and we use that, and we're signed up to it. And I should use it a lot more. We have GitHub now, so obviously if people have GitHub accounts, then we can follow each other and keep track of what we're doing on that site a lot better as well. It does a lot better job of flagging up what other people are doing. It's more social than Google Code was, let's say that. We are interested as well, maybe I can learn a bit off you on this, Richard, in setting up IRC or something equivalent. I know that's very successful for the Pound Alfresco group. So we'd love to set something up similarly for Share Extras. Excellent. Okay, thank you.